Hello YouTube, this is a new Unknown Cameraman podcast series. This one is about abandoned hospitals and the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. How do confidential records get left behind? Who is responsible? And why is this so common? The haphazard way in which sensitive confidential patient records were left behind raises the question of why these buildings were abandoned so hastily. Why are there a growing number of abandoned properties today? What is the environmental and financial impact this has on society? These are the questions that I'd like to ask and address in this video. An alarming number of state-owned medical treatment centers around the country built on the taxpayer's dollar are now left abandoned, rotting in decay and neglect, which were often shut down because of patient abuse and inhumane living conditions. The longer these condemned facilities sit, the more it is costing taxpayers. Officials don't do enough to alleviate delays in development from zoning complications, back taxes, contamination removal, among several other expenses for security and more. The list goes on. If a logical and more efficient system were put in place and available for the realty market, these crumbling, boarded up buildings would no longer be a growing problem in this country and would be inhabited and cared for by business owners and families who would then actually be making tax contributions. This new system would have to be signed in as a law by the very same people who got us into this mess in the first place. It's safe to assume the problem continues because the officials responsible for not solving the problems are the same individuals that would be issuing the fines and seeking to punish the party in violation. I don't foresee any of these officials voluntarily turning themselves in. I'm saying that the people who violate the law are the ones that would be enforcing the law. So why would they go out of their way to say, hey, you know what? I didn't do my job. I should probably fine myself for not having done that. Adding to the misconduct and responsibility of these medical treatment centers is the violation of HIPAA regulations. Confidential records and documents containing sensitive patient and employee information have been left abandoned and unsecured in these facilities, as you've seen in several of my videos. On top of that, there are concerns of the environmental impact these out-of-date, derelict state facilities may have from asbestos, medical waste, and more, contaminating the soil and groundwater. So let me back up for a minute if you're not familiar with what HIPAA law is. Currently, federal HIPAA law requires all state and private-owned establishments, such as hospitals, to protect confidential information like patient records. HIPAA was established as a law to protect many things, but one major component was to protect the personal information of the citizens of our country. This includes sensitive identifying information such as social security numbers, date of birth, along with the protected health information, such as your diagnosis. But in an alarming number of cases, when a medical treatment facility closes and it is eventually left abandoned with all of these unsecured private files also left behind, these derelict structures are often visited by vandals, scrap metal thieves, and curious explorers who have seemingly unlimited access to almost anything that was once highly protected in the building. How is it that these structures are left to rot in the first place? Many buildings could have been saved, but the lengthy time frame it takes to turn the property around causes irreversible damage from neglect. How is it that when these establishments are abandoned, that these confidential records could be left behind for anyone to dig through or take for themselves? Who is to be held accountable? On August 21, 1996, the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act was enacted by the United States Congress and signed by President at the time, Bill Clinton. Title II of HIPAA defines policies, procedures, and guidelines for maintaining the privacy and security of individually identifiable health information, as well as outlining numerous offenses relating to healthcare and set civil and criminal penalties for those violations. Title II requires the Department of Health and Human Services to draft rules aimed at increasing the efficiency of the healthcare system by creating standards for the use and dissemination of healthcare information. The problem is, even though that was signed into law, nothing is really being done about it, and it's not being enforced. On October 21st, 2012, federal officials started an investigation on how patient records loaded with intimate medical details and doctors' personal files were abandoned amid the ruins of a medical center in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, when its administrators walked away from a failing facility in 2006. The records, in easy reach of vagrants, arsonists, and other trespassers who frequent the condemned building, were uncovered when attorney Scott Avolio inspected parts of the trash-filled complex with a Tribune Review reporter and photographer. Rachel Seeger, spokeswoman for the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, confirmed, disposing of individuals' health information in a manner that is accessible to unauthorized persons is a violation of HIPAA regulations. So she confirmed that this was a violation. Among its many provisions, HIPAA, once again enacted in 1996, protects the security and privacy of healthcare data. Civil and criminal penalties for violating the law range from fines to 10 years in prison, depending on how the violation was committed, according to the Act. But as you can see, dozens of abandoned hospitals across the country have sensitive, confidential information or materials left behind. This regulation has been violated since the day it was enacted, and very little seems to have been done about it. Hospitals are obviously not permitted to simply abandon records in a dumpster that are accessible to the public, but HIPAA does not require a specific disposal method, only that the records are secured and protected. So it's pretty loose, it's open to interpretation, but they have to do something. These records are readily accessible, attorney Scott Avolio said, surveying the building's rubble that also contains physicians' licensing information and medical students' evaluations. There's definitely sensitive information here, he said. The hospital, closed in 2006 after a number of failed state inspections, has been condemned by officials who say they don't have the $1 million needed to demolish it. There has since been a string of suspicious acts of arson to the hospital on July 9th, 2011, October 8th, 2011, and January 31st, 2012, and then again on April 30th, 2013. I'm not sure if there's been more since then, I haven't checked, but as far as I know at this point, the building is pretty much burned down to the ground. On an interesting, unrelated side note, the CEO of the hospital, when it closed, is awaiting trial on charges that he partially bit off his brother's nose during a New Year's get-together. He's the son of the founder of the health center in 1952. Avolio has attempted to determine who served on the hospital's board of directors during its final days, hoping to identify who is accountable for the dilapidated structure and its contents. Because the hospital was mired in bankruptcy proceedings and regulatory problems for decades, the issue of who controlled the facility and who is ultimately responsible for laws possibly violated remained murky, Avolio said. The issue took on new importance when Avolio unearthed the patient records with names, addresses, diagnoses, detailed treatment plans, insurance information, dates of birth, social security numbers, and more, while stepping around piles of unused syringes and trash. City officials have denied repeated requests to tour the main building, citing structural deterioration and the existence of cancer-causing asbestos. Later that year, officials from the State Department of Environmental Protection removed biomedical waste, traces of mercury, and blood products from the facility. DEP spokesman John Poyster said the unused syringes do not pose a health threat, adding that the DEP has no further jurisdiction in the matter, so they're not going to remove that stuff. In a doorway to the emergency room, Avolio found stacks of confidential intern and resident reviews containing medical licenses and DEA identification numbers, codes assigned by the federal agency to medical practitioners licensed to dispense or prescribe medications. Avolio said some of these former interns and residents still practice in the area, which means that those DEA identification numbers are still active, which means if somebody were to go in there and get that information, they know the DEA number, they know what their signature looks like. All they would need is a few blank prescription forms, which I'm sure are sitting around as well. They would be able to fill out a fake prescription, go to CVS, and sign off on prescribing themselves whatever kind of medication they want, and it would look legitimate because everything checks out. And this isn't a hypothetical, people actually do that, and that's why this is a problem, because there are people that go in there and are able to abuse the system, signing off all kinds of painkillers, you name it. They have access to it. This is something that the medical community themselves should be upset about, because I know of at least one case where there was a doctor that got in trouble because they were saying to him, hey, you're giving out prescriptions to people that there's no warranted reason for it. And he said, I don't know who this is. I don't know who, I didn't write this out. And I don't know if he ended up losing his license or he had to go to court to prove his innocence. But essentially, this was somebody whose information was stolen, and he was getting in trouble for the people that were taking advantage of him. So you'd think if more doctors were aware of this, they would be fighting to protect themselves as well, or at least complaining that whoever is supposed to be enforcing this actually does their job, so that it doesn't come onto them and force them to have to go to court to defend themselves for something that they didn't even do. Not only that, but because they also have access to the Social Security numbers and everything else, there are cases where people have gone in and essentially claimed whatever leftover money was available in bank accounts belonging to residents who have since passed away and didn't have any family, and they are also taking advantage of that. So wait a minute, I just said that this isn't being enforced, and then immediately after said that there was a federal investigation against this place. So which is it? Well, there was a federal investigation, and then the result was that Donetta Spears of the DEA said leaving DEA numbers strewn about does not violate any federal law. Great. Anyone could essentially walk in and obtain DEA numbers forms and write fraudulent prescriptions. Avolio's discovery occurred just weeks after officials from the State Department of Health insisted that when the medical center closed, hospital officials complied with the law by informing the state that patient records had been secured. But spokeswoman for the Department of Health said the hospital was not required to disclose where the records were stored, adding that her department has no further jurisdiction in the matter, so they won't be looking into it. It is the responsibility of the owners to take appropriate steps to maintain and then destroy the records, she said. Department of Health jurisdiction ended the day that it closed and surrendered its license. So how are they supposed to enforce what happens afterwards if their jurisdiction to be involved and investigate ends before then? It seems as though the law is written in a way to hold one single individual, the custodian of records at the time of the center's closing, fully accountable for disposing of the records and seemingly responsible to do this without any assistance. But if that one individual is responsible for it and they don't work there after it closes, how are they supposed to do that, and how is the Department of Health supposed to investigate it if they don't have any jurisdiction to? As I mentioned earlier, in addition to the personal medical information lying around, there is a real risk of identity theft in individual Social Security numbers that are on the patient charts. This is clearly a callous disregard of the trust that patients are assured by administrators as well as by state and federal officials. Also, if a facility receives federal funding to take on students as interns, the facility may be in violation of the Federal Education Record and Privacy Act, known as FERPA, which was created to ensure minimum standards for protecting education records. So there's just so many violations happening here, and as you can see, like, the attempt to do something about it is very half-assed. I mean, they're like, we checked it out and we didn't really see anything. I mean, if the DEP can see that there are syringes lying around and they say, well, that's not really a health concern, or if they are made aware that there's stuff inside, they say, well, we don't have any jurisdiction to do that. If somebody requests to say, we want to look inside to make sure it's secure, they say, well, you can't really go in there. So the idea is that the way that their law is written is that the hospital says, yeah, I mean, we boarded it up, everything's fine. But then if somebody, obviously, as it always happens, they take the boards off and they go inside, they say, oh, well, I mean, that's a shame, but we can't really do anything about that. So, which, as a side note, is a whole other problem, that they're paying oftentimes for additional security for these facilities to make sure that people don't go in. From not demolishing it or turning it around after it closes, it's just sitting there, and if there was any kind of environmental impact from any kind of medical waste or things like that, by letting it sit there even longer, it's getting more and more into the soil and groundwater. So if they would just take care of that quicker, it would be a lesser problem. But oftentimes these facilities become Superfund sites because they end up getting so contaminated after years of neglect. So that's just a whole other thing that they could address a lot quicker and just turn these facilities around and let somebody come in and redevelop on the area. But again, if you're in the realty business, why are you going to buy a facility or a plot of land like this where you're inheriting the debt of the environmental cleanup and the demolition and all the other things that come along with getting it ready to develop, when you could just go get a piece of pristine land somewhere else to do it? So obviously it's not an ideal place to buy and build on. So it's just set up for failure, and they really need to do something about that. Nobody ever gets held responsible for this. It's just an ongoing problem, and I don't really know how anybody's going to fix this, but I just thought that I would bring it to your attention that this is happening. This is a violation. It's been going on for as long as I've been alive. There's another case that I might go into in another video of another facility, and I just thought I'd bring it up. So, like I said, this is just one example of an abandoned facility that's in violation. There's probably hundreds across the country that are exactly the same, if not worse. This is a common problem that seems to only be getting more prevalent, particularly with state-owned hospitals. Records indicate that private-owned medical centers received hefty fines for a number of small violations, while state-owned facilities have literally been getting away with murder for the last century.